Long before iron rang against iron on sun-warmed battlefields, long before the names of kings and conquerors echoed through the corridors of time, there was a whisper in the jungles and savannas, a slow, thunderous murmur of feet heavy with power, yet tender as the earth beneath them. These were the great gray guardians of the ancient world, elephants, sacred beasts, beings of strength and wisdom, whose story would one day entwine with the dreams of empires. It is said that in the beginning they were just creatures of the forest, walking in quiet grace beneath emerald canopies, drinking from still lakes under the gaze of a silver moon. But humankind watched them with wonder. They were too immense, too majestic to be ignored, too intelligent to be treated as mere animals. In time, they would become more than beasts. They would become symbols, companions, and in an age shaped by conquest and ambition, they would become instruments of war. The first whispers of elephant cavalry rise from the mists of the Indian subcontinent, where time folds itself into myth and memory. Here, perhaps, as early as 1500 BCE, men began to dream of harnessing the might of these noble titans. The mahouts, their lifelong handlers, learned to speak. In soft commands and firm touches, their bond with the elephants, stronger than any chain. One could not command an elephant with fear. Only respect, only trust could guide them into the tide of battle. As the centuries ripened and fell away like petals from a tree, the early kingdoms of India began to weave these giants into their armies. By the time of the Maurya Empire, around the 4th century BCE, the elephant was not just a participant, but a towering pillar of military might. War elephants clad in armor, draped in finery, bearing howdahs with archers or spearmen, stood like living towers upon the battlefield. They could trample infantry underfoot, scatter cavalry, and strike fear into the hearts of hardened soldiers. But they were more than tools of war. To kings like Chandragupta and his grandson Ashoka, the elephant was a symbol of legitimacy, of divine right of the earth itself, lending its strength to rule. But beyond the great rivers of the subcontinent, news of these war beasts traveled on the winds of trade and conquest. To the west, Alexander the Great, young, bold, and luminous with ambition, encountered them in the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE. It was there he faced King Porus, whose elephants loomed like mountains upon the misty plain. The battle was fierce, uncertain, and left an indelible mark upon the Greeks. Though Alexander emerged victorious, the power of the elephants sobered his men, casting long shadows across their dreams of further conquest. And so the tale of elephant cavalry began to spread. In lands far from their forest homes, elephants would find themselves painted into the strategies of generals, into the hopes of empires. Carthage would raise them. Rome would fear them. Persia would revere them. But all of that still lies ahead wrapped in the golden fog of time. For now, the scene quiets again, and we return to those first ancient dawns in India, where the jungle breathes softly, and the hush of 1,000 leaves carries the memory of the first war elephants. Their eyes old and kind watched over the birth of this mighty tradition one step at a time. As the world slowly turned and the stars wheeled overhead, the story of elephant cavalry meandered westward like a broad, glistening river. Following the glimmering trails of Alexander's campaigns, the Greeks carried tales of these colossal creatures, how they thundered across battlefields like storms on legs, how they could shake even the boldest formations. Though rare in their own lands, the image of elephants began to etch itself into the dreams of generals and kings far from the forests of India. In the wake of Alexander's death, his empire fractured like glass under pressure. His successors, the Diadochi, fought for dominion in a world suddenly unmoored. Among them, Seleucus Nicator, the founder of the Seleucid Empire, saw the power of elephants not just in warfare, but in diplomacy. When he ceded territory to the Indian king Chandragupta Maurya, it was not just land that passed hands. It was a gift of 500 war elephants that shifted the balance of power in the West. These elephants would later play a decisive role at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, where their mighty presence turned the tide, giving Seleucus victory, and proving that the beasts of the East could change the fate of empires. And so began the age of the Hellenistic war elephant, not just a creature of awe, but an integrated force of battlefield strategy. In places like Syria and Egypt, under rulers such as Antiochus and Ptolemy, elephants were bred and trained, sometimes imported across great distances, to stand in glittering formations beneath foreign suns. These elephants, often smaller than their Indian cousins, African forest elephants, or Asian varieties, reared in foreign lands, still held immense symbolic and tactical value. They were the thunder before the clash, the weight behind the will of kings. Farther west, across the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean, another power stirred the rugged, cunning city of Carthage. It is here that the story of elephant cavalry takes on a darker hue, one shadowed by struggle and obsession. Carthage, nestled in North Africa, lacked the towering elephants of India, but possessed the native North African elephant, smaller, swifter, and just as fierce when driven by courage and fire. These elephants would become the companions of one of history's most enigmatic and ambitious commanders, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal. His name, like a whispered spell, still carries across time. It was in the late 3rd century BCE that he led his legendary march from Iberia across the Alps, a feat so improbable that it remains half history, half legend. With him traveled a small force of elephants, creatures unused to the biting cold and narrow, perilous mountain paths. They were wrapped in blankets, fed warm mash, coaxed onward by mahouts, who murmured encouragements against the freezing wind. Though many perished in that treacherous crossing, their presence in the Italian heartland struck Rome with deep, instinctive fear. Elephants in the Alps. It was a vision no Roman had dared imagine. At the Battle of Trebia, and again at Lake Trasimene and Cannae, Hannibal's elephants charged like shadows from the forest. Crashing through lines of soldiers, their trunks raised high, their eyes gleaming with the strange awareness that only elephants seem to carry. Though their numbers dwindled, and Rome eventually recovered the legend of Hannibal's elephants, carved itself into Roman memory like a scar. Rome, wise in the ways of power, would not remain ignorant for long. The Republic learned, adapted, and adopted. In their wars against Porus of Epirus, another general who had brought elephants across the sea, the Romans faced and studied the beasts, discovering their weaknesses and growing stronger. What had once been terror became understanding, and in time, Rome too would come to field elephants, especially in its early Eastern campaigns. But elephants were never quite Roman. The animal that fit best in the soul of Rome was the eagle, sharp-eyed, far-seeing, and forever soaring. Elephants, with their gentle intelligence and deep, slow strength, remained somewhat foreign, somewhat mystical. Their time in Roman service would be brief yet unforgettable. And so the stage began to widen as elephants walked across continents, not only in flesh and bone, but in story and memory, in symbol and spectacle. In the theaters of Rome, they were paraded in triumphs made to kneel before emperors, or tragically displayed in deadly games. No longer merely soldiers, they had become emblems caught between admiration and cruelty, used to reflect the might of men who longed to tame the wildest forces of the earth. Yet, still in the east, in the dense jungles and broad rivers of India, elephants remained revered not as tools or trophies, but as sacred companions treated with reverence, draped in cloth of gold, their presence a bridge between the earthly and the divine. And from those sacred lands, new kingdoms would rise, ones that would lift elephant cavalry to dazzling heights. But that part of the tale lies just beyond this moment, waiting in the gentle hush of the next chapter. The centuries passed like clouds across a sleeping moon, and in the east, the story of the elephant cavalry grew richer, more intricate, more entwined with the very heartbeats of kingdoms. As Rome expanded and Carthage fell to dust in the lands of South and Southeast Asia, the age of elephants was blossoming in full. From the Ganges to the Irrawaddy, new dynasties rose, each one drawing strength from ancient traditions and sacred beasts. Among the lush jungles and golden plains of India, the elephant was never simply a beast of burden or war. It was Ganesh, remover of obstacles. It was Airavata, the mount of Indra. It was memory and future, a moving monument to patience, strength, and divine order. In the courts of the Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, and the mighty Cholas elephants were treasured companions, nurtured and raised with ceremony and care. They were born into roles not unlike princes, washed with perfumed waters adorned with bells and silks, their every step watched by caretakers who knew their moods like old friends. When they marched into battle, it was not as beasts, but as warriors with titles, ranks, and sometimes even personal attendants to guard their flanks. And across the Bay of Bengal, in the fertile lands of Burma, in Cambodia, Siam, and beyond elephant cavalry was not merely imported, it was reborn. The kingdoms of Southeast Asia, drawing from Indian influence and their own rich traditions, embraced the elephant as a symbol of power and divine right. In Angkor, capital of the Khmer Empire, elephants were used not only in war, but in processions that shimmered like dreams, parades of gold, incense, and music with elephants at their heart, carrying kings beneath golden parasols. The art of elephant warfare became a science and a ritual. There were formations crafted specifically for them, tactics designed to amplify their thunderous impact. Sometimes they led the charge. Other times they were held in reserve, waiting like thunderclouds before the storm. Some carried archers. Others bore pikemen or sword-wielding guards. Their tusks were sometimes fitted with blades, their foreheads painted with holy symbols. They could break a line, hold a fort, inspire troops, and intimidate foes without a single blow. But as the world turned, it also trembled. Empires fought not just against outsiders, but within themselves. Civil war, succession struggles, and shifting loyalties often saw elephant against elephant, two great creatures forced into confrontation by the wills of men. It was in these moments, in the hush before a duel, that observers often noted the most startling thing: elephants would sometimes refuse to fight. They would stand still even under lash and flame, unwilling to harm their own kind. And in those pauses, brief and terrible, there was a glimpse of something older than war, something gentle, something sacred. In the kingdom of Siam, elephants were elevated beyond measure. White elephants, pale with rare pigmentation, were revered as divine omens. To possess such a creature was to be blessed by the heavens. To gift one to another monarch was to seal peace or alliance. But to go to war with white elephants in one's ranks was to declare not merely military might, but cosmic favor. Thus, elephant cavalry became not only a tool of the battlefield, but a language of diplomacy, of symbolism. Their presence in parades, in coronations, in treaties and truces, each step carried meaning echoing far beyond the jungle paths. And yet, even in their majesty, they were not invincible. as new weapons crept into the world. Crossbows, longbows, and eventually gunpowder. The balance began to shift. But in this era, in these centuries of splendor, the elephant remained undiminished. They were kings of the battlefield, and of the heart walking with the slow grace of legends across a tapestry of kingdoms. Still, the shadows were beginning to stretch. From the west and beyond the seas, new powers stirred ones that would come not to revere but to challenge. And so the next part of the tale awaits us, just over the horizon, where the sound of distant drums begins to mix with the echo of muskets and sails. The winds shifted, not just in the jungles and valleys of Asia, but across oceans, across deserts, as the great age of gunpowder began to stir. In the dim glow of twilight, when elephants once ruled the battlefield, new sounds crept in foreign and sharp. The metallic clack of rifles, the rumble of cannons, the distant echoes of change. In India, the mighty Mughal Empire rose like a jeweled mountain from the earth, blending Persian elegance with fierce Central Asian valor. The Mughals revered elephants not only as instruments of war, but as symbols of imperial magnificence. Their stables held hundreds, sometimes thousands each, trained in the subtle arts of battle and pageantry. The court of Akbar the Great glittered with elephant processions. Lines of tusked giants, clad in armor, their backs carrying nobles beneath howdahs of gold and silk. They were used not just to charge into enemy lines, but to trample fortifications, pull great cannons, and carry the weight of prestige. Duels between war elephants were a form of entertainment and practice, where the creatures were matched in carefully watched contests of strength and skill. Mahouts, those quiet guides who spoke the secret language of elephant minds, became as important as any general. But the Mughal story, like all empires, carried both ascent and descent. And as the centuries passed, the thunder of cannon grew louder, and the glint of European steel spread wider. The Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British and French all arrived in ships heavy with ambition. They brought not only guns, but a very different understanding of warfare. One that moved faster, hit harder, and left less room for the slow and steady power of elephants. And yet, for a while, the old and the new danced together. In the battles of the 17th and 18th centuries, it was not uncommon to see elephants lined up beside cannon batteries, their great ears flapping in the smoke. Their hearts, steady as musket balls, flew like wasps. They still inspired awe, still broke enemy lines with raw strength, still stood firm while soldiers faltered. But gunpowder is a cruel equalizer. In the Battle of Plassey in 1757, a turning point in Indian history, the British East India Company used disciplined deception and devastating firepower to dismantle larger traditional forces, including their elephants. No longer was courage enough. No longer was sheer size sufficient. And yet even in this era of upheaval, elephants retained their power in the mind. In Burma, in Siam, in Vietnam, kingdoms still trained them, still painted their hides in bright colors, still sent them forth in royal pageants that made the earth seem to sing. In Laos, they became guardians of sacred forests. In Cambodia, they marched in step with kings as they had for centuries. But slowly, the battlefield grew less welcoming. The noise of muskets frightened the beasts. The heat of cannon fire wounded them, and the tightly packed formations they once crushed were replaced with fluid skirmishing lines and hidden rifles. War was no longer a theater for the noble and the bold. It had become a storm of smoke and metal, indifferent to grandeur. In the 19th century, under colonial rule, elephants became servants more than soldiers. They helped build railways, clear forests, haul supplies for armies. In some cases, they were conscripted into colonial campaigns not as chargers, but as laborers, as porters. Still strong, still dignified, but slowly fading from the stories of war. And yet they lingered. In ceremonial uniforms, in royal festivals, in the hearts of those who remembered. A visiting European might see a king on his elephant and marvel at the spectacle, not knowing he was witnessing the end of an age. For even as the sun seemed to rise higher, its light grew colder. The 20th century waited on the edge, and with it came machines' mechanized war, and a speed that elephants, creatures of patience and memory, could never match. Still, their footsteps echo. In the margins of history, they remained watching, remembering, as if waiting for the world to slow down again, to listen. To remember the rhythm of a time when war moved to the sound of drums and the soft, immense tread of an elephant's foot upon the earth. As the world stepped into the 20th century, everything began to quicken. Steel and steam blurred across the landscapes, slicing through jungles and past ancient ruins. Wars were no longer bound by the rhythm of hoof or foot. They now rode on rails and roared through the skies. And yet in a few corners of the earth, elephants still marched. In the great theaters of the world wars, elephants no longer stood at the center of battle, but they were not forgotten. In Burma, during the grinding campaign between Allied forces and the Empire of Japan, elephants returned not as cavalry, not as chargers of the front line, but as lifelines through the deep green silence of the jungle. British and Indian forces retreating or advancing across that dense terrain relied on elephants to carry supplies, haul artillery, even evacuate the wounded. They became bridges over rivers where no bridge could stand shoulders, where no engine could pass, and calm hearts in chaos. Their mahouts, many of them from tribal communities, who had known elephants all their lives, worked with quiet diligence, often leading their gentle giants through shell-scarred forests under fire, and into stories that would never make the headlines. It was in this twilight of relevance that elephants offered their last quiet contributions to modern war, not as terrors of the battlefield, but as quiet heroes of necessity. And then at last, even that faded. With the arrival of helicopters and tanks, of global logistics and instant communication, the elephant, ancient as stone and sky, became an anachronism. No longer feared or depended upon, they were revered only in memory. But that memory was rich, layered like the folds of their skin. Even as the last military elephants were retired, their legacy lived on in parades, in temple festivals, in stories whispered to children under star-flecked skies. In Thailand, the Elephant Festival of Surin became a spectacle, a tribute to what once was. With costumed reenactments, mock battles, and ceremonial processions, the memory of elephant cavalry was kept alive in dance and ritual. Visitors watched wide-eyed as trained elephants performed old maneuvers, their movements echoing battles long turned to dust. There was no blood, only beauty and the soft sigh of history remembered. In Laos, the elephant became a symbol of conservation, its strength now a thing to protect rather than wield. Forest elephants, once war-trained, now helped in logging, or were gradually freed to roam, again in peace. Their stories etched into the living land like footprints in wet earth. And in India, where their presence had once been nearly divine, elephants remained symbols of fortune, strength, and grace. Though no longer marshaled into war, they walked in royal weddings and religious festivals, sometimes painted with brilliant patterns, living canvases of a vanished age. Their tusks still shimmered in memory, but more often now, people looked into their eyes, those wise, slow eyes, and saw a reflection of something gentler, more enduring. In museums and old books, one might still find the faded illustrations of armored elephants in battle, their riders poised with lances and swords. But the real memory lived elsewhere, quietly, like a river beneath the soil, in the songs of forest dwellers, in the weathered stones of ancient temples, in the stillness of jungles, where their kind still walk not as warriors, but as elders of the earth. Though war had long since moved on the idea of the elephant cavalry, its grandeur, its paradox of might and mercy, remained tucked within the folds of time, sleeping like an old tale waiting to be told again. Though their role on the battlefield had ended, the echoes of elephant cavalry lingered in the rhythm of modern memory, like a slow drumbeat beneath the noise of progress. Their image, majestic and serene, moved from warfields to the hearts of nations, from strategy to story, from power to poetry. In the quiet corners of Asia and Africa, where the canopy of trees still touches the misty morning sky, elephants became part of a different kind of battle, the fight for survival. No longer caught between kingdoms, they now stood between ancient ecosystems and the encroaching hunger of industry. And here, too, their history as cavalry beings guided not only by humans, but by a deep inner strength, seemed to lend them a quiet dignity as they adapted, resisted, endured. In India, sanctuaries blossomed where kings once rode. Forests reclaimed old paths trodden by war elephants, now walked by their descendants in peace. The bond between mahout and elephant, forged long ago for battle, softened into one of protection and care. It was no longer about training for combat, but understanding healing and learning how to live alongside these massive feeling beings. Their history shaped not only national identity, but ecological reverence. Museums across the world began to house remnants of their legacy, tusks engraved with tales, scale models of war, howdahs, faded paintings of battle scenes and royal hunts. Yet even behind glass, the aura of those elephants remained. Not fierce, but noble. Not brutal, but brave. Scholars pored over ancient texts interpreting tactics and ceremonies, while artists and filmmakers, touched by their tragic grandeur, began to reimagine them, not just as tools of empire, but as characters in a great and mournful epic. These creatures, once pulled into the service of kings and generals, had come to represent something more elusive, the soul of history itself. Heavy, vast, silent, and unforgettable. In Thailand and Myanmar, retired elephants were brought to peaceful parks and temples, where tourists and pilgrims alike came to witness not a performance, but a presence. Some, moved by old tales, bowed before the elephants in quiet respect, not out of superstition, but awe, recognizing in them a living link to another time. They were not only survivors, they were teachers, still carrying the patience of centuries. Across the globe, in lands far from their native soil, the legend of elephant cavalry became a subject of gentle fascination. Children in faraway countries read stories of ancient warriors astride mighty elephants, their eyes wide with wonder. In dreams, these creatures still marched beneath starlit skies across lands of gold and green. And so the history of elephant cavalry drifted into myth, not vanished, but transformed. Their might softened into memory. Their charge slowed into stillness. Yet something about them, something ineffable, lingered in the collective human spirit. Perhaps it is the way they moved, not with speed, but with certainty, or the way they remembered, not with bitterness, but with calm, or the way they stood tall, quiet, immense, as though carved from time itself. As modern nations rushed forward, many looked back toward these creatures not for conquest, but for wisdom. To understand what it meant to lead without haste, to fight without cruelty, to carry burdens without complaint. to be powerful, yet gentle. And so, in this soft era of reflection, the tale of the elephant cavalry did not end. It simply walked into a new place, a quieter world of dreams, stories, and memory, where it could never truly fade. In the slow hush that follows thunder, when all the battles have passed and the earth is left to breathe, the most enduring truths rise quietly to the surface. So it is with the story of Elephant Cavalry, a tale that began not in the halls of kings or the pages of scrolls, but in the silent forests where humans and elephants first met. It is easy to think of history in grand strokes, empires and campaigns, treaties and collapses, but the story of elephants in war is filled with quieter moments too. A mahout whispering a command only his elephant could understand. A lone animal waiting at the edge of a river for a fallen companion. The sound of bells tied gently to a tusk jingling in rhythm with steady footsteps. As the sun set on their military use, elephants themselves did not vanish, nor did the impressions they left behind. Instead, they stepped slowly and with grace into another kind of legacy. In the poetic traditions of South and Southeast Asia, elephants often symbolized not destruction, but memory. The Ganesha of Hinduism. The wise elephant-headed god was never a warrior, but a remover of obstacles, a guide, a protector of beginnings. In Buddhist tales, elephants appear as sacred beings of deep serenity and mindfulness. And in local village myths, they live on as forest spirits, as keepers of forgotten roads, as ancient listeners to human dreams. These stories gave rise to a deep spiritual inheritance. Even those who had never seen an elephant came to understand their role not just as animals, but as vessels of the past. The world remembered them not only for their size, but for their silence, for their patience, and for their presence. By the late 20th century and into the 21st, a quiet but determined effort emerged to protect what remained. Conservationists, scientists, and storytellers all gathered beneath the same cause to ensure that the last remaining elephants would live not in fear or exploitation, but with dignity. Sanctuaries replaced stables. Tracking collars replaced chains. Education replaced spectacle. Children grew up learning about elephants not as tools of war, but as treasures of the earth. Some visited the places where they once trained ancient fortresses, crumbling palaces, jungle paths now overgrown, and found there not ruins but memories etched into stone and bark. In Cambodia, in northern India, in the mountains of Laos, and the floodplains of Sri Lanka, elephants still roam, sometimes in small herds, sometimes in solitude. When they walk, the land remembers. When they trumpet, it's as if they call out to those lost centuries, reminding us gently we were here, and we carried your history on our backs. They have become, in a sense, our shared elders, living symbols of a time when might was measured not just by firepower, but by endurance and trust. When the bond between species was part of survival and war, was something felt not only by men but by beasts, trees, and sky. And as the world slowly wakes to the damage it has wrought, it also begins to listen again to the wisdom of creatures like these. To move more slowly. To carry only what is necessary. To live with memory rather than against it. So, as our journey nears its end, we see that the story of elephant cavalry was never truly about war. It was about connection, about loyalty, about the way two beings, human and elephant, walked together into both the light and the dark of history. And though the battles are long past, the footprints remain. Not just in the soil, but in the stories we tell when the night is quiet. And we remember the sound of a distant horn, the shimmer of armor in the dawn, and the shadow of an elephant vast and gentle, walking into the mist. Let us now slip gently into the final hours of our tale, like a river gliding through dusk toward the sea. The history of elephant cavalry, long and winding, began in a world of myth and mystery, when people first beheld these towering creatures and saw in their strength a spark of the divine. Across jungles and plains, through the thunders of war and the hush of retreat, elephants moved with solemn grace, their stories interwoven with those of kings, conquerors, and commoners alike. But in the end, what remains is not the clash of armies, nor the shining helms of warriors perched atop howdahs. It is something far quieter. A memory, a rhythm, a presence, like the low, slow beat of an elephant's heart. In our final reflections, we find ourselves returning to where we began, not to the might of war, but to the wonder of being. The elephant, now free of the burdens of battle, walks among us still. In national parks, in sacred groves, in stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren. They are no longer weapons, no longer tools of empire, but mirrors of our deeper self-beings who remember, forgive, and endure. There is a story told in a village at the edge of a great forest. An old man, once a mahout, would sit by the river in the golden hour and whisper the names of the elephants he had known, each one like a prayer. He would tell the children how the elephants remembered paths he had long forgotten, how they would stop before old temples with eyes that seemed to listen to the stones. He would say, to ride an elephant was not to be above it, but to be beside it, carried by something older and wiser than ourselves. That perhaps is the heart of the matter. For all their glory in battle, the true legacy of the elephant cavalry lies not in conquest, but in companionship. In the deep, wordless trust between human and animal. In the slow march of time, where each step presses softly into the earth, leaving behind more than footprints, leaving behind meaning. And so we close the tale not with a trumpet, but with a hush. The war cries have faded. The armor is rusted and gone. But somewhere in the distance, beneath a canopy of green and a sky of silver dusk, an elephant walks. Unhurried, unbound, remembered. Let this story stay with you, like the shadow of a dream of misty mornings and forest paths of gold-tipped tusks and wise eyes of battles long past and peace longed for. Now, with your thoughts gently resting, may you carry this memory into your sleep. May the echo of elephant steps guide you into stillness. The tale is told. The elephants sleep. And so too may you. Good night.